currently I'm using a barge system from the lower deck to the upper deck, and it works good, but it's a little slow and it does create a bit of a bottleneck during operating sessions. So I'm going to replace these two corner modules and this corner module with a 4-foot by 4-foot helix. It will be a freestanding helix, so it'll be just a matter of moving these two out and moving the helix in. Over here, this will be upper level and lower level decks for the helix, cut at 4-foot by 4-foot. And here we have the fascia board, the legs, and the supports for the upper level. So the upper level and the lower level will be tied together, and then the legs will be screwed to the upper level supports. And these are just strips of 1/2-inch plywood cut at 3 inches wide for my fascia board, and there'll be plywood will be mounted on top. So I'm going to start nailing these two together to get my top and bottom, and then we will lay out the first ring on the helix. What I did is I made a template out of a large piece of cardboard. The center line, I don't know if you can see that, that's a 19-inch radius. So once I mark that out on my plywood, you can see that this is 4 inches from the edge. That's my module standard. That will enter my helix, and also I got a switch here that will go all the way around the outside of the module to allow for constant running on the lower level, and also to backtrack on the upper level to get to the harbor, which will now be operated as a industry itself. So once I start cutting, it's hard to see, I will start cutting my helix at the halfway point, so at 2 feet. 2 feet from the edge here, right there. I'll start cutting my helix all the way around, and I will finish it right here at this line, and the height will be 2.5 inches between decks. So that'll give me a 3-inch rise with the thickness of the plywood. And I'll have to do that probably around 8 times. I'm going up 22 inches between levels. So up here and down. That will allow running around this area here to down. Okay, so I've done my layout. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. Try to do it with red pen or red pencil. But I've got all my coils for the helix. You can sort of see it there. Laid out to try to maximize what I can get from 4x8 sheet of 1/2-inch plywood. And these are all 4 inches wide. So it's time to start cutting. See how many I get. Okay, so brought out the 2 modules, the upper decks that I made yesterday. and did my cuts. This is the lower deck, so sort of how the supports going through to support the upper deck. So my main line comes in, and I started my cut halfway through the module at 2 feet, and I finished at 14 inches from the edge. And then this will give me my first ring to a finished height of 2.5 between levels, or 3 inches plywood top to plywood top. Also, here's all the rings out of that plywood. This gave me 6 rings. This is all the waste that came from that, which isn't a whole lot. I'll be cutting that up into strips 2.5 inches tall by about 1.5 inches wide or so, maybe 2 inches wide, and those will become my risers for the Helix. So I'm just going to cut out the second, the upper deck, and it'll be a mirror image of, it'll actually be basically what this one is right now, where the grade goes down. Okay. So I decided I'd cut a few extra pieces for the Helix. This is out of 4x4 half sheet of plywood. This is pretty much the best way I could get the biggest pieces out of this. Sure how to try. So that's sort of how it's laid out. That gets you the biggest pieces out of here with the least amount of waste, at least I've found. So I'm going to continue cutting these out. And there's one. There's another one. Just sort of a side note that I was thinking about. When you're doing your template to create the half circles, this was the one I showed you earlier. It was a full circle, but I had to cut it in half because when you're laying it out, when you're laying your curves out, it's very important to make sure that this flat side is all the same. So when you go to put all your sections together, you don't have a big gap. So to do that, that was the center of my template, and all I did was just mark an X in the center to give me 90 degrees, and then I cut my template. Just thought of that now, because that's really important when you go to assemble everything. That's the last one. There's all my finished rings, and there's 7 here. I needed around 7.5. There is some short sections that I'm going to probably not use unless I need to make up a spot, but there's also nearly a full section on each, the upper deck and the lower deck. So time to start assembling. I started assembly. Figured I'd about halfway now, so I'll show you what I'm doing. Sort of, now that I've done this many, I've got a bit of a system to it. So basically, the first level isn't done yet. I want to get top and bottom sections together, and then I'm going to sort of split the difference between my run up on my first level and my run down on my second. As far as the stuff in between, it's all at 2.5, so that'll give me 3 inches top to top. What I've been doing is I put one section down. I'm just working on this section here, so I have the finished spot of the previous ring with the 2 risers, and it's a split joint on the risers. So I put one screw in for this next piece, and then I just sort of prop it up, as you can see over here, and then this will be the starting of my next ring, and it's another split joint. And then all I do is align, make sure that all these are as close as I can get them, and then as it's going, I'll try to stagger my risers just to sort of spread the load down. And then once I get all the risers on this upper one, I just lift it up a bit, put a little bit of glue, and then put a few screws in on an angle. This will allow me to take off each deck, but it'll leave the risers in place, so I can basically dry fit the whole Helix, and then just take it apart, lay my track. I'm only going to run a single track to begin with, but there is enough room to run a double, but I'm building it so I can take it apart if needed down the line, because it is 80 feet of track going to be in this Helix. So I'm going to keep going. So here's the final assembled, well, the main assembly of the Helix. Got the coils all lined up as far as matching goes. There is a gap right here. The top deck still isn't fastened on there yet, but once it is, it will be level, as you can see. So you can just ignore this. This will be scenic, because my main will come around here, and then I will enter the Helix somewhere around here. I'll probably have to sand that a little bit just to get it perfect, but that's the idea. All 2.5. The other thing that was a little tricky was getting my spacing. I still have to fasten this down here, but getting my spacing from 2.5 down into the center, 1 7/8, 1 1/4, 15/16, 5/8, and this would be 5/16, and then down to 0 or back to the 2.5. So that's how I build it. Now it's time to take it apart and lay some track. Here's a completed Helix. All I have left to do is my lower track and my upper track that bypasses the Helix. But here's the first train down. Hopefully there's enough battery. still have to add a bunch of feeders into this, but there's feeders at the beginning and the end right now. Also, you'll note I laid the track to the outer edge, so there is room to add a second track at a later time. Not too bad of a time to come down.